cities. This was a chart that put together last week looking at the city of Chicago. You can see here that the community that's been greatest affected in terms of disparities and death rates from COVID-19 has been the African American community. And you can see that their rate of death is 3 times that of what we see in the Latinx community, and about 3.5 times of that of what we see in the white community. And I'll talk a little bit about some of these social determinants or drivers of this outcome. I just want to pause here and state that the recommendation now is that everyone wears a face covering when they're out and about. When you look at these masks on the far left-hand side of the screen, these are masks that are typically worn in a healthcare setting. And they do provide prevention from catching this infection, at least from a respiratory perspective. It is possible also, you can have droplets that contact the mucous membranes in the eyes, so that is a risk for exposure. The main point from this slide is that while it's important that everyone wear a mask when you're out and about, you should not have a false sense of security that if someone else has a mask on and you have a mask on, you can stay close to each other and talk and just have a good time. These items on the middle of the screen and the right-hand side of the screen do not protect you from inhaling viral particles. The best benefit here is that it's as if everyone's walking around with their hand over their mouth. So the likelihood if someone coughs or sneezes that they're dispersing a lot of droplets in the air is much reduced if everyone is wearing a mask. So that's the primary benefit here. So let's talk a little bit about what happens with the infection. Sort of ignore this complicated diagram and just listen to the following. This infection causes a lot of challenges in the small blood vessels in the body. Most of us think about individuals having problems breathing. We've talked about these national campaigns to get ventilators assembled. But this virus also can have an impact on the heart, causing heart attacks and heart injury. It can impact the kidneys, reducing kidney function, and some individuals require dialysis while they're in the hospital. It can also impact liver function. We're also seeing increased strokes. So there are a variety of sort of multi-organ effects that we see with complicated courses of COVID-19. Let me also step back and say that 80% of individuals that get COVID-19 really have little to no symptoms or have a very mild course of illness. So what I'm talking about here are the individuals who may find themselves in a hospital and have a really complicated course of illness. These are the things that are occurring. So let's talk a little bit about some of the demographics that we're seeing with hospitalizations. This slide here represents data collected by the CDC from 15 states and about 100 counties across the US, about 32 million individuals in terms of the population size, about 10% of the US population. And so they collected COVID-19 hospitalization data from all of these counties. And what they've seen here is that while non-Hispanic whites represent 59% of the population across that area, which is the aqua blue here, you'll see that their hospitalization rate in that population is about 45%. And the non-Hispanic Black community, again, their population representation is 18%, but they're almost double that in terms of their representation of individuals hospitalized. And then when we look at the Hispanic or the Latinx community, they represent 14% of the population and about 8% of the hospitalizations. The next slide from the same data set reflects that the older you are, the higher your risk of being hospitalized with COVID-19. Again, individuals in the young ages, 0 to 4 up to 5 to 17, not a lot of hospitalizations, but when you start to hit the 50 and above, 60, 70 up, hospitalization rate increases significantly. This slide here, I'm gonna skip because I've pretty much covered it in the prior slide. Let's talk a little bit about social determinants of health. So why are we seeing this? Are we seeing something that is a surprise to us, or are we seeing death rates and disparities in infection and death and hospitalizations reflecting things that maybe have been going on in our healthcare system and our society in general? I'm gonna say that I think it is the latter and not the former. So let's talk about social determinants of health. Income. We see in these same communities where we see higher rates of hospitalization and higher deaths, we see lower paying jobs, more jobs that are in the service industry where you're interfacing with other individuals, so that increases your risk for infection. And we also recognize that income inequality has been a challenge for those communities as well. Housing plays a role. So we know that there's a long legacy of redlining that has far surpassed the end of the legalization of that. That legacy still persists when we look at residential segregation in cities across the United States. There's a correlation to higher household density in terms of the number of individuals who may live in a household, which increases the risk of transmission and the decreased ability to self-quarantine. We also know that access to healthy food is a challenge in many of the same communities. So you may have more fast food restaurants around and less fresh food. And what does that mean? If you've got fast food, you have food that's cheap, that has high caloric high amount of fat, low nutritional value, fills people up, easy to access, but also promotes an epidemic of obesity. Then we look at transportation. We know that individuals who are of lower income may be using mass transportation at a higher rate, good for the environment. But when you're also looking at challenges around transmission of infection, you can see that if you're leaving a community that's distressed from food access, high density in terms of population, and then you're on a crowded train or bus, you're headed to work, and then you're in a service environment, you're not dealing with one issue, but you're dealing with multiple issues that increase the risk here. And then we also recognize that education is a challenge in terms of ensuring that there are good funding of schools, literacy, health literacy. All these things impact health status for communities. And so at a baseline level, when we take away the COVID-19 pandemic and just look at what's happening in our communities, these same communities suffer from shorter life expectancies and higher rates of infant mortality. So on an ordinary day, from cradle to grave, we see significant disadvantages in health status. And so this is now illuminated significantly in the light of COVID-19. The next few slides I'm gonna run through very quickly. These are some slides I was actually able to borrow from a colleague, Dr. David Williams, who's an economist professor at Harvard. He pulled together one slide that evaluated a study that was done recently that looked at environmental quality in communities where individuals who were hospitalized with COVID-19, and it found that those individuals who live in a community where the air quality was not good actually had a higher rate of death and a higher rate of hospitalization. To continue with a few of his slides, when you look at the onset of high blood pressure, and this comparison here looks, is a comparison between the white subpopulation and African-American subpopulation. But you'll see that at every age bracket here, African-Americans tend to have an earlier onset of high blood pressure than their white counterparts in the same age group. If we look at diabetes, we see a similar trend where we're getting diabetes earlier. So it's important to recognize this. And if we layer on top of this, we can also look at it from an economic perspective. The good Dr. Williams put this slide up because it was really easy to understand. So when you look at median household income, median means you get it right in the middle. So 50% of people make above a certain amount and 50% are below that amount. And so for every dollar that we see in median income for the white community, when we look at the Hispanic community, it's 73 cents. Or in the African American community, 59 cents, or the Native American community, 59 cents. When we look at a median household wealth, so again, 50% of the folks in any of these categories have a wealth or a median net worth above the amount and 50% below that amount. And you see the huge disparity there where for our white Americans, 171,000 versus African Americans, 17,600. Hispanic Americans, 20,700, significant disparities. So I like the way that Dr. Williams put it. This virus that we're fighting is not a virus that's attacking individuals based on their race and ethnicity. We're all in this battle together. We're all out here rowing in this storm, this ocean together, but we're in different sized boats. And the size of those boats is impacting how individuals within the boats are faring in the storm. And in closing, I just want to note that there are some resources available on the internet that I've published here recently on LinkedIn that talks about social distancing, provides some additional information that may be of benefit to individuals. So I would encourage you to go on LinkedIn and do a quick search for Derek Robinson for some of these topics, and you can find additional information. And one of these articles also reviews this drawing that is our public health officials have been undervalued, and we're really seeing them shine during the course of this pandemic. But this does some of the tracing between when an individual who had COVID-19 was in an environment, who they came into contact with, and what happened as we move out. And that reminds us that while there's a lot of discussion around testing, we also have to ensure that the contact tracing component occurs as well. So I think I kept us on target, Reverend Crumpton, so I'm going to turn it back over to you. And I look forward to hearing our additional esteemed panelists and participating in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robinson. Yes, you are very much on time, and that was I'm so grateful for such a systemic view, right? So you gave us an understanding of what COVID is, how it functions, but also to connect it to the systemic context. And I think the best part, I think for me personally, well, two parts was, for one, I can't get it walking out and cutting my grass. It's not going to blow from somebody's lawn over into mine.
It's not going to blow by.
Because I've confined myself to the yard, and I've been very concerned about these kinds of things.
Yes.
A, and B, also the visual with the boats, right? The various, like there was one with a little rowboat, and there was like several others that were like submariners, you know, they were, so the difference in terms of being equipped to respond, right?
Absolutely.
Very, very helpful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate
You're welcome.
that. I'm sure we'll have several questions for you, but we're going to move over to kind of thinking about the systemic in conversation with the individual in terms of how we can take care of ourselves as we're facing the challenges that Dr. Robinson just laid out for us. And for that, we'll turn to Ellen Muhammad, who is our registered dietitian. Ellen, how can you help us think about our own immunity and things that we can talk about in terms of nutrition, in terms of building up our immunity?
Sure, Dr. Stephanie. I too prepared a few slides to actually walk us through that process. First and foremost, let me just say thank you to the host for having me. I am a registered dietitian with advanced practice experience in diabetes, weight loss, and of course, optimal nutrition. I own my private practice where I actually specialize in educating and devising nutritional plans to help individuals meet their nutritional goals, whether it be optimal nutrition, disease prevention, disease management, and weight loss. So as the title reads, I wanted to take a few minutes to discuss food to boost immunity. This topic is a very hot topic today, in fact, and legitimately so. Nowadays, all of us are very, very interested in knowing what additionally we could do in addition to, of course, the guidelines that Dr. Robinson just spoke of, but what in addition we can actually do to protect ourselves against the virus. Regardless of whatever social media feed or whatever news station you're actually tuned into, you'll see a lot of discussion or a lot of talk about food to boost immunity. Next slide, please. Despite the recent heightened attention to food and its role in actually supporting our immune system, we've known for a long time now that certain foods can actually, in fact, contain nutrients that our immune system needs in order to defend against illness and disease, essentially. We've had years and years of evidence of the capacity of nutrients to do so, but it's important to note that as it relates to COVID-19 or its clinical course, of course, nutrition and immunity, essentially, there's no evidence to date, or of course this is new essentially, but I just wanted to actually give this disclaimer that whether the measures or not that we talk about today haven't been evidenced or supported essentially at this point to determine whether or not there is or is not a specific influence in the susceptibility of COVID-19 or its clinical course. Essentially, we're very new in this thing. So I just wanted to actually state that. But what we do know for certain, again, is that certain foods actually have been and have demonstrated the ability or capacity to contain nutrients that our immune system needs to defend ourselves against illness and disease. Next slide, please. So what are those stars essentially? Meaning what foods do we know that have demonstrated the capacity to perhaps assist and support the immune system in fighting off illness and disease? There are a number of players in the game, but I chose to actually just slim down the list to just 5. So we'll be discussing 5 stars that we know, and actually a great majority of us on the call are probably quite familiar with some of these things as well. So what they all have in common essentially is antioxidants. And we'll be talking about 5 stars today, meaning five key nutrients that we know to be supportive in immunity and assisting our body in the ability to protecting against disease and fighting off illnesses as well. So first things first, let's talk about the antioxidants. Essentially, those comprise of 3 vitamins, vitamin A, vitamin C, and vitamin E. And we're also going to talk about a few minerals as well, including zinc and selenium, that have also demonstrated the capacity to support the immune system in its role, essentially. So I've summarized a brief list of some of the food sources. This is in no way an exhaustive list, essentially, and I don't expect you to recall all of these, but as a quick frame of reference, actually going forward, as we work to actually incorporating more of these foods into our intake, you'll note that there's some similarities, and essentially the common theme is plant-based food sources, essentially. Right? So let's go into each of these things and kind of dissect each of the food sources, and you'll begin to see for yourself the common denominator that all of these nutrients and vitamins share in common. So vitamin A, the first star for the day. Where can we get vitamin A from? From bright orange and yellow colored food, essentially. What does that mean, for example? Sweet potatoes for one, mangoes, carrots, red peppers or bell peppers, eggs, and also green leafy vegetables, very nutrient dense sources, all for vitamin A. Moving on to vitamin C, one of which is probably the most antioxidant that a great majority of us are familiar with. But just in case, vitamin C sources can come from strawberries, mostly fruits in general, of course. They're berries, oranges, lemons, red peppers, and also green leafy vegetables as well, and mango. Those are all very good contributors of vitamin C as well. We'll move on to vitamin E, again, another antioxidant and a star of the team that actually has been known to assist our immune system in protecting us against the viruses and disease, certain viruses and disease. Vitamin E, primarily sourced from cooking oil. And in fact, wheat germ oil is very nutrient rich of vitamin E. In addition to cooking oil and wheat germ oil, we can also obtain vitamin E from nuts, seeds, spinach, and broccoli as well. Moving on to the minerals that I alluded to, in addition to the antioxidants, zinc and selenium both are also known to contribute to strengthening and boosting our immune system. Zinc can be found or consumed by consuming whole grains. That would, for example, include like popcorn, quinoa, brown rice, oatmeal, whole grain cereals, etc. In addition to our whole grains, we can also obtain zinc from beans, nuts, seeds, and some meats are actually rich sources of zinc as well. And the last star of the team we're going to talk about in this short time today is selenium. This is probably a new mineral for most of us, but actually also does contribute some benefits to the immune system as well. And for those of us that are not quite familiar with selenium, Brazil nuts is a very rich, dense source and a contributor of selenium. So if we want to kind of investigate that mineral further, Brazil nuts would be a source, sardines, oats as well, beef, and eggs. All right, so I wanted to just summarize, again, a lot of options here, but the common denominator that you'll see in all of these contributors would be plant-based options, right? So in fact, if you aren't able to recall the specifics of the food sources and the vitamins and minerals that we talked about today, just the take-home point, I guess, essentially would be fruits and vegetables. Loading up on fruits and non-starchy vegetables, essentially, will actually be a very good, appropriate approach to doing what we can as it relates to nutrition and diet to strengthen and boost our immune system to better fight off and protect against illness and viruses. And then again, just going back to the earlier advice that most of us got from our parents when we were actually young and in the cradle, eat your vegetables, right? Because they're good for you. And in fact, that is in fact true. So again, if you can't recall all of the various sources that I went over today, just default to knowing that eating more non-starchy vegetables and fruits are going to benefit you as well as your immune system to better prepare and defend against illness as well as disease. Next slide, please. And again, I'm available as a resource. I do, again, in my private practice, see clients on a one-on-one basis for anybody who has additional questions regarding what we talked about today, food sources. Again, that wasn't an exhaustive list. We can definitely get more into the topic, essentially, as it relates to just specifically individualizing a meal plan for you or anyone interested. We also have access to recipes, and we'll also, again, address how much of these vitamins and minerals are appropriate in order to get the best benefits out of immune protection, essentially. And here's my contact information as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. I've got a couple questions because I'm thinking about all that you just shared right now. It's so helpful and insightful and also accessible. Like I could get it, right? Sometimes nutrition can feel very overwhelming. My question to you is, so is it okay to eat frozen vegetables and frozen fruits, or does it have to, so I heard you mention fresh vegetables and fruits, but is it okay if all you have access to, or it's your preference to eat them frozen? Is that adequate?
Yes, it absolutely is appropriate for you to consume frozen vegetables. Frozen actually ahead of or in lieu of or instead of the canned variety, because once we get into the can, we're going to get into more of a high sodium content. So yes, if we don't have access to fresh vegetables, as many of us do not under the current circumstances, frozen vegetables are equally as nutrient dense as the fresh variety.
Okay, so I'm hearing frozen over canned, though, if it's possible.
Certainly, especially for those of us who actually have past medical histories inclusive of hypertension or high blood pressure, then we certainly want to avoid or minimize our intake of canned vegetable sources. Okay. And with there's so much accessibility for frozen options. Literally, if you go into the supermarket nowadays, there's an entire aisle dedicated to so many varieties of frozen vegetables that just about any one of us could find something that we prefer in that list that we just talked about. Okay. Minus the salt.
Minus the salt. Okay, good. And also, I'm thinking about, so I have to confess my guilt and shame. So the words that I heard from you were low starch, which probably means low carb. So for those of us who tend to enjoy carbohydrates and sugars, or carbohydrates to become sugars. So what I recognize is I'm doing a bit of stress eating as well as other people are, right? Yeah. So do you have any suggestions for how to manage, right, our nutrition and diet during this time in some ways that give us healthy eating coping practices? Because I've been known to make an 8:45 run to the grocery store headed for the pastry aisle.
Well, let me reassure you, Dr. Stephanie, you are not alone, right? In this time of uncertainty, stress eating and overindulgence, whether it be in high calorie foods or high sugary beverages or desserts, as well as alcohol, for some of us have become the norm, right? And that's probably because, based upon the circumstances, a lot of us feel as if we don't have control over much lately, right? And I don't have to go into the particulars, but I invite each of us to actually take control of our food choices, right? You may not have control over your financial situation right now or anything else that many of us are managing right now, but what we do have control over is, in fact, our food choices. What do I mean by that? there's no expectation for you to deprive yourself, right? But I encourage you to take control by essentially being mindful and intentional as it relates to your food choices. For example, I mentioned fruits and vegetables. How can we become more intentional and more mindful and actually in taking more of these antioxidants and minerals that we talked about? Answer, loading up on fruits and non-starchy vegetables. So yes, carbohydrates is a common comfort food for just about the entire planet, right? So when I'm referencing non-starchy vegetables, I'm only eliminating off of the entire list of vegetables your potatoes, your corn, and your peas, essentially, and beans if we want to talk about that, but that's an aside. But essentially loading up on fruits and non-starchy vegetables, whole grains, lean proteins, and introducing heart-healthy fats into your intake. The second strategy would be try to skip or minimize, avoid, or limit even your intake of all of those comfort foods that we talked about, the alcohol, the high sugary beverages and snacks and desserts, etc. Right? How can we best do that? Just employ a strategy when we're grocery shopping, right? If we don't buy those foods, we don't have access to them when we're at home quarantined. So that would be a very good strategy to minimize your intake of those comfort foods or stress eating. And then also another strategy would be just maybe assigning a day of the week or time of the day that you'll actually allow yourself a treat, right? Mm-hmm. And then lastly, plan. Essentially, whether it be planning, preparing a meal plan for a day, preparing a meal plan for a week, essentially, as long as we have a plan in place, we're more likely to focus and stay on track toward eating healthy.
A plan. Okay, a plan, and don't bring it home.
Exactly.
Because if it's not in the house, you can't get to it.
Exactly.
Very good. Very good. Very good. I think you're inviting us. To really be mindful about our food choices and how we're treating our bodies. Thank you so much. We're going to come back to you and Dr. Robinson a little bit later in the Q&A. But we're at this point, and this is wonderful. We're getting some good, important questions in the chat. This is helpful. We're going to move over to Dr. Hema Pakarna. Ellen, as you were talking about mindfulness, I was thinking about our food choices. It made me think about the work that Dr. Pakarna does in terms of mindfulness in general, because what we're dealing with is a virus that is attacking our body and impacting the entire society. And one of the things you also mentioned was that we have little control over very few things, right? But one thing we can have some control over is a little bit in terms of what we do with our mind and how do we situate ourselves in our body. And so for that, we turn to Dr. Pakarna. Dr. Pakarna, go ahead and please take us in about mindfulness.
Welcome all of you, and thank you for being here. Let's begin with just kind of now moving from listening to at the head level, the information we are getting. Now let's move and experience that we have a body below our heads. So I invite you to just rise in your chairs or wherever you may be sitting and just stand up if possible. And then extend your hands besides yourself up like this. And just experience the space around you. Yes, thank you, Stephanie, for demonstrating it. Yes.
I need this too.
Yes. And just kind of give yourself a little twist and just feel the circle around you. Create a little circle and a space around you. And then lift your hands above and create the space and recognize the space that is around you. And that is the space that you have, your presence, your aura, your energy that can be expanded. And just see what difference did that make, if any. And then gently, gently bring your hands back to your side and have a seat. And now just kind of become aware of the change in your breath and bring all your attention as much as you can to your breathing. Take nice deep breaths. Inhale and let go. Just slow down the pace of it.
She's muted.
Hema, you can go ahead. You had been muted for a moment. You're back now, though.
Yeah. Yeah. So continue breathing, continue feeling the heart rate. And just allow those heartbeats to slow down. And just check with yourself, asking yourself, how am I? And wait and listen to what you might hear. How are you? And now just come back. Become aware of the light in the room, the air on your skin, and gently come back. And check, how are you feeling? Is there any difference? Was there any difference from the minute we began to this minute? And it is barely like 3-4 minutes, I would imagine. And see, it takes this little time to bring ourselves back and center ourselves. And why is this important? So once, a disciple asked his master that, why is all this important? Is there anything that I need to make myself enlightened and able to connect with myself and make the magic of healing and self-connection? And the master said, as little as you can do to make the sun rise in the morning. And so the disciple asks, then what use are these spiritual exercises that you prescribe? And the master says, to make sure you're not asleep when the sun begins to rise. So what does this mean in our context is that we've heard about from the doctor, from the nutritionist, that there's so many things that can affect, but there is something that is internally, innately alive and active that heals our bodies. And therefore, most of us are still alive in spite of the endless traumas that we have handled. And so many of them have not survived. So what is the difference? Yes, the external situations do impact. The roaring sea, the ships do make a difference. And yet there is something in us that stays alive. And many of us have seen little plants growing on a rock. So that quality of resilience and vitality, how do we have access to it every time? And especially when there is more infection and more dangers of infections around us. So the practice of mindfulness simply means being aware. And you will hear the word awareness, mindfulness, and meditation, and self-connection, centering. These simply mean how do we access the divine in ourselves, divine or the healing power, that is the healing force that is within us? And so I would like to introduce the term namaste active for you to actively use. Now, anyways, we can't shake hands, so the namaste part. But understanding the meaning of it, the namaste is, I bow down to the divinity in you that exists in me also. So we are like connecting with each other at a divinity place. And what divinity means, not necessarily anything that is connected to religion per se, but for our purposes, we can understand it as a spiritual force, a life force that keeps us alive, that aliveness. And that aliveness force is the innate force in us that generates the capacities for us to heal. Okay. And many people may take the antibiotics and vaccines and things of the kind, and yet not all survive the infections. So what is the difference? It's the capacity, the innate capacity that we have. We could call it inner strength, we could call it health. But the important thing to remember is that you have that capacity. And that capacity can be simply accessed by being aware of that capacity. That is by doing nothing really, but being who you are and allowing your mind to quiet down. So allowing your mind to quiet down and connecting recognizing that you have a body and not just the brain that keeps talking. So allowing your mind to quiet, allowing the thoughts to stop, and simply bringing your attention to the breath, which is one sign, one symptom of life. And so accessing that at any moment. So take a moment again to become aware that you are breathing beings, that you're being breathed. So just kind of become aware of the breath coming in and coming out. That's it. If you just begin to practice knowing that you breathe, and then just follow the breath. And as you're connecting with the breath and as you're connecting with the body, recognize it automatically relaxes. You don't have to do anything at all. And as the master said earlier, that you really don't have to do anything because innately we have the capacities, and the sunshine and nutrition and all those are contributing factors to preserve life. So now on a daily basis, what can you do is very important. And given that we are inside from the external environment, now to be able to come back inside into your bodies and stay there. And there are many, many practices to do that. And so one is to just simply slow down, no rush. And luckily, one of the advantages of blessings of COVID has been the ability to stay home and to be able to stay focused on that quality of gratitude, of what is really useful of this time. And so no rush, no time to rush, basically. That's one key piece. And then while you're connecting, where do you keep your mind and your thoughts is on gratitude. What is working well in my environment? I have a roof, I have running water, I have toilet, I have some access to food. I have friends, I have internet. So even if sitting with breath is not the easiest thing, channel your mind to something that gives you energy and revitalizes you. And then some sort of journaling, becoming aware of your feelings, your fears, your confusions, and coming back with those questions and sitting with them, knowing that innately you have the wisdom and the knowledge to recognize, and giving your space to access your own wisdom is really what mindfulness is. And there are many, many practices that one can engage in. But the key practice is beginning with your breath, allowing your mind to slow down and really accessing your body and inviting the body to continue to heal. And that could be done through prayer, that could be done through meditations, yoga, several other ways of connecting your mind, body, and the spirit. I should stop here now. I can't hear.
Thank you so much, Hema. It's the simplest thing to just stop, but sometimes it's really hard to remember it. So I have to say that I really appreciated the opportunity to stand up for a minute and to breathe and to come back into the body. So thank you so much. Again, I think those takeaways are slow down, no rushing. And sometimes that can be a little hard to, slow down and focus on the breath. That can feel a little overwhelming, especially if you're in the middle of some real high anxiety. So to also have the option to just focus on what is working well, right? What is well, and I love that you were basic with it. Is there a roof over my head? Do I have running water? Do I have friends, right? Those kinds of basic things, right? Journaling as an option, also being in touch with your feelings and your fears and confusions helps us to kind of pay attention to what's real versus what is imagined or what is not. We don't have to anticipate what is coming. We can just deal with what's happening right here and right now. Thank you so much for that. We're now moving into our Q&A. So we're inviting folks to begin to put your questions in the Q&A, but I do have a few things that I want to begin our Q&A with. And Dr. Robinson, I want to back up to you. So you did an amazing job, and thank you so much for helping us get clear about some of the particular vulnerabilities that may be pre-existing conditions in terms of heart disease or diabetes, things like that. My question is for folks who have other vulnerabilities like cancer or other kinds of respiratory concerns, are those things that also make them more vulnerable, or is it really kind of fairly confined to that list of factors that you identified? Just kind of want to get us clear about what is a real concern and what is kind of urban myth kind of thing, because there's a lot happening.
Yeah, Reverend Crumpton, great question. A couple of things. One is I think we have to be humble as we deal with this infection, appreciating that there are a lot of things that we don't know. So I think what we're trying to do is begin to share the best information that we have as it becomes available. I think it is safe to say that individuals who are living with cancer and may be under treatment like chemotherapy and may have a depressed immune system, on a normal day, not dealing with the pandemic, they're at increased risk for certain types of infections. So certainly if you're in that category or you're on medications that suppress your immune system for some other reason, or if you're living with HIV and AIDS, these are things that you would be concerned about if you're a patient who has experienced a transplant, for example, and you're on immunosuppressants. Again, during a non-pandemic period, you would be concerned about the risk for getting infection because you're on immunosuppressants. And so those things would apply during this setting as well.
Okay. And the follow-up to that is because we want to be safe, and we recognize we're probably going to be in this for a while. And at the same time, we all have people that we love. So do you have any suggestions as a medical physician, right?
Sure.
I want to go to the medical people about
what are they doing?
what are the safe ways, right, that we can have some contact with people without endangering ourselves or anybody else? Like,
Sure.
Is the 6-foot rule with gloves and a mask? Is that okay when you're visiting someone who's older? Like, just so we can get clear on what is an option and what isn't. Like, because some friends of mine and we were contemplating a dance party in a very large parking lot that we would all be 3 cars away from each other but dancing so we could see each other with masks on. Like, yeah, I'm
Yes,
actually
yeah,
pretty serious about that. I just want us to,
yeah.
because we can't, the human need for contact is real, but we don't want to kill each other trying to be in contact with each other. So
Understood.
what are some options on what we can do to connect safely?
Yeah, so it is challenging to address every potential scenario, right? Because we're trying to be innovative and figure out how to work around this new normal that we find ourselves in. At a very basic level, individuals that live in the same household together generally can continue to engage with each other as they normally have. I think the exception becomes if one of those individuals becomes infected with COVID-19 and needs to self-quarantine in a portion of the home. And we recognize that not everyone has that luxury, and that creates some of the public health risks. Do you subject everyone in a household to becoming infected? And also, just given how easy this virus tends to spread, there's sort of a likelihood that the other folks may be infected anyway, but are you able to get that person somewhere else? Loneliness is a real issue. And we all know older individuals and younger individuals in our families and communities that may, on a normal day, live by themselves, but have the benefit of having community. And bridging that gap during this time period can be very challenging. I think so. We can be innovative. You can have someone outside the window on the phone. You see each other. You're talking. That's a mechanism. Folks are connecting by Zoom, and FaceTime and other video conference mechanisms. I've heard of friends having taken their kids for a ride and parking at the end of the driveway and rolling down the window and waving at some friends that are on the porch. That kind of thing. Those are generally safe approaches. And I think the situation you described, large parking lot, folks are 5 meters apart. They got their mask on, but they're not, getting together. Then I think that is an innovative approach. It almost mimics people being out, but they're socially distant. They're wearing their mask and the like. So we just have to continue to be vigilant. We have to appreciate that even your physicians and researchers don't know everything. And so as we move through this process and treat more patients and complete more research studies, we're going to learn different things that may change the guidance that's being provided. And we just have to remain vigilant and recognize we still have some runway ahead on this.
Okay. And one thing that, one last question that came up while you were talking, can you share what are some of the things that not necessarily are conclusive, but some of the things that are emerging around COVID with young people, right? So I did hear you say, like, we have to be humble about this, but if we could get a little bit of information about, because initially this was supposed to be impacting older people, but that's not what we're seeing. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so much of the data that we've seen both here in the US and in different parts of the world reflect that individuals who are, under the age of 18, children generally do well. And that doesn't mean we're not going to have what I would describe as sort of isolated situations where we have a child that suffers a sort of unfortunate course of illness with COVID-19 or has some other pre-existing medical conditions that might have a course that could lead to long hospitalization or death. But when you look at the numbers in mass, generally those young people are doing well. One of the things that we don't know is really how many folks are infected with the virus. And so we could find that the denominator is way larger than what we know, because our numerator, the number of people infected, is driven by how many folks we can actually test. And so as we test more people, we may find that, not the denominator, we find that numerator, number of folks that are infected, is actually a lot larger, could involve even more kids and more adults. And that'll change kind of how we describe, the risk factors there. But I think that's kind of the best information that we have so far, and it reflects what I've seen from guidance from the CDC and other entities around populations that are at greatest risk. And even as you look at hospitalizations by age band, both internationally as well as in the US, they're fairly low in that 0 to 18 category.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We're trying to make sure we get sound, clear directions. So thank you. That's really helpful.
So it doesn't mean that they can't get infected.
Okay.
It means that they're generally doing okay. It doesn't mean that they can't pass the infection on to people who are at risk and may not do well. So grandma hanging out with 12-year-old grandchild who's asymptomatic, has an infection, spreads it. Different scenario for grandma than for grandchild.
Thank you. That's helpful. Thank you very much. Ellen, we've got a question here. The person has written, thank you so much. We should all eat to live. What is your thought, right, regarding supplements and vitamins, turmeric, things that people are aware of or have been kind of hearing around, the kind of homeopathic or just kind of supplemental things that we can be doing to boost our immunity? Uh-oh, let's see.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry. I was just responding and commenting, saying that's an excellent question, in fact. As it relates to supplements, we strongly encourage all of us to actually get all of those nutrients from food-based sources, essentially. Now, of course, supplementation would be and might be appropriate under certain circumstances, but first and foremost, we strongly encourage us all to seek those nutrients from food-based products and sources. As for the other question in regards to different vitamins and I guess other things that we are aware of that may also contribute to immunity, yes, this presentation was not intended to be an exhaustive list at all. In fact, as the participant inquired, there are a number of other sources that we know or that research has evidence that could potentially aid in actually strengthening and protecting us against illness and disease. For instance, turmeric, garlic, ginger, green tea, just to name a few. So yes, very good point. In addition to those things that we talked about, we do have evidence that suggests that those foods, as well as the additional supplements, or if you will, additional options that I just made mention of, can also play a key role in protecting and defending against illness and disease.
Okay. And so to be clear, they are strengthening our ability to fight off, but it's not a barrier, right? It's not, we're not confusing something like vitamins or eating well as the thing that then makes you immune to COVID, right?
No, not at all. Exactly. And I'll defer to the physician on the call for that. Okay. But just to clarify, right? No, they actually provide the nutrients that are necessary for our immune system to be better equipped and prepared to actually defend against certain illnesses and certain diseases.
Well, Ellen just gave me an excuse to go get some dried mangoes that I've been craving. So.
Okay, and since Dr. Robinson, since we have you back, there is another question here. I see, and the person writes, there seems to be rumoring that symptoms or manifestation of COVID may look different with Black and Brown people and not the list that we often hear. And more specifically, they're referring to things like blood clots or other breathing issues, which can affect the body more rapidly and can do so without warning and create urgent need for care. Followed by a second question, and this is in the chat in case you need to look at it there in front of you. Are COVID test results skewed or affected by certain medications that may also be in someone's system? I'm assuming at the time of the test itself.
Great question. So let's start with the second question. I'm not sure whether the test for COVID, whether you're infected or not, is impacted by other medications that an individual may be taking at the time. I haven't seen any literature speaking to that. It's a good question, but I don't know. To the first question regarding symptomatology varying by race and ethnicity, I haven't seen a lot of information regarding that either. When we look at some of the studies of people who've been hospitalized and the symptoms that they present with, if we are able to acknowledge that African Americans, for example, are overrepresented in the population of people who are being admitted to the hospital and dying, you would think that the symptoms that they're presenting with is represented in that data in terms of the type of symptoms that folks are presenting or patients are presenting with. So I'm not sure that there is a list of symptoms that show up more predominantly in the African American population versus the Hispanic population versus white population and others. I haven't seen the data broken down that way.
Okay. And part of it is things are emerging. So I appreciate your comment about being humble about what we know and also what we anticipate being able to integrate into our knowledge. Oh, and then the person says thank you. Just posted.
You're welcome.
Okay. One of the things, Reverend Dr. Barber, can you, you've got a comment here in the chat that you've offered, and I would love for you to kind of field it out here to the community so we can talk through it a little bit about the interrelatedness of the presentations and some of the things that you also noticed as well.
Sure, thank you. As I listen to all three presenters, I really note the interrelatedness of the presentations in this way, concerning health and immunity and its relationship to COVID-19. I heard it as a individual and community model, which means that we certainly, each presenter named that we as individuals have to be clear about our own medical and health statuses and the nutritional needs that are important for us as individuals, practical ways that we can prep and plan our food and our grocery shopping to help us build resilience and immunity. And then the interrelatedness, but not only for us as individuals, right, but for our families. And so this thing of this information that's being shared today, it is for us, then our families, and all of us. And so, and then the ways that as individuals and community members, we build our resilience with this practice of mindfulness, right? Accessing within ourselves the capacity within us from the divine, from our Creator, to slow down and allow our emotions and minds to settle. So I'm struck by, in a day in which our understanding of the systemic is important, as Dr. Robinson already noted. I mean, we can look at medically, right, and health, social determinants of health, and all of the impact of that, that's in all of the systems and sectors. And yet, as individuals, there are some avenues for us individually and collectively to impact forward movement. And that really strikes me with this. Certainly caring for self first, that's important, in our families, and also our various communities, whether faith communities, educational systems. So those are my immediate thoughts.
Yes.
Any other reflections for our presenters on any of that?
It's well stated.
I do what you just raised does make me think about the long term, right? Not just the long, well, I should say long term and long haul. We're going to be in this for a while. And so the information from the medical field is going to continue to evolve. We're going to continue to also need to find creative ways to manage food access, which, by the way, in May, we will have a conversation about food access and food scarcity, and also financial stress and financial trauma. We'll be dealing with those in May. But Hema, I'm struck by, I feel like we can have the medical information and we can do what we can to feed ourselves, but I'm also thinking about the mind, right? The power of the mind, because right at this moment we're dealing with grief. We're dealing with an unbelievable amount of uncertainty. And so my question to you, Dr. Bukarna, is how do we build a long-term, how do we have baby steps towards a long-term commitment around mindfulness and meditation? And is there a difference between mindfulness and meditation? Because the truth of the matter is that stress is also a salient factor, right? In how our bodies respond. And when we're stressed, we eat things we're not supposed to. When we're stressed, our blood pressure goes up, all those kinds of things. And one of the ways that we can work on that can be mindfulness and meditation, but that could be a tall order, So are there some baby steps that you can kind of help us think about, so we have the steps that you have there, but literally, because the idea of meditation can be a little overwhelming at times, especially with so much happening in the world, which also creates a lot in the mind. But are there baby steps towards this journey of mindfulness? Because we're going to be at this for a while.
More than baby steps, we are naturally meditative and mindful. It is just a question of when we allow our minds to get distracted, to bring them back. So it's nothing different than we are already doing, but just bringing the awareness. And my practices, more than baby steps, I would say practices. If you can just sit, even for half a second, if you can just allow yourself to sit and say, oh, here I am, I'm breathing. That's it. That could be a tiny baby step. Just constantly becoming aware that you're alive and you're breathing, and allowing that, with that, to watch, become aware and allow where your mind is, what's happening, what are you thinking. So noticing, recognizing, and allowing, and knowing that you're in your head, and the thought process, if you can get control of through this breath process, can be a great help. And sitting, the first thing that you get up in the morning, become aware that you are alive, be grateful for that. Take a moment to breathe, look around, check your mind, check your feelings, and then decide, set an intention that I'm going to continue the day in peace and harmony and in extension of love and healing, or anything that's important for you. So just like you go pick up your clothes from your wardrobe, create an internal wardrobe where you choose and pick and decide what you're going to wear internally, and maintain the access to it constantly. Keep in contact to that internal clothing that you might wear in the form of love, compassion, silence, harmony.
Dr. Burkhardt, I have a question, and this might seem a little basic, but I think it's pretty important, because what I recognize is that this illness, as Dr. Robinson pointed out, there are systemic factors that make the experience of this illness different for different people. We're all on the same water, but we're in different boats, right? And so I think this is kind of an important question to ask. Is it okay if you are not directly impacted, if you're well, is it okay to just stop for a minute and be grateful that you're okay, right? Because I'm thinking about how if you are a part of a community, or if you're part of a family, right, where others are not doing well, right? They may be exposed because they're essential workers and they can't stay home in the way that maybe you can, or that or if you and yours are fine, right? But you may be an anomaly in your community. You might be part of a community that is particularly susceptible or struggling. Is it okay, right? And I know it sounds a little silly, but I'm a little concerned about how sometimes we're not okay with being okay. And that can be a challenge.
Right.
Can you speak a little bit about that? And maybe, and somebody's even named it kind of like survivor's guilt, to be okay, like, and to take care of yourself. Is that all right? How do we address matters of survivor's guilt when we're trying to take care of ourselves to continue to be well?
Right. So just being aware of that you have this thing going on in your head. It's a head thing going on, that you kind of feel guilty that you're alive, others don't have it. It's a healthy guilt if you can manage it properly. So it's like when you're in an aeroplane, you are invited to put a oxygen mask before you help the others. So maintaining your internal health is very, very crucial. So I do a lot of work with doctors and helping them to manage their immunity and sanity while they're dealing with other people. So self-care is the key part here. So there's really I can't say that there's no need for guilt, but I would say recognize that you have this guilt and unpack the word guilt and see what it means. It just simply means you want the same thing for the other person. And then give it to them while maintaining yourself. So charity is one of the key things that we constantly do. We do collect money, we do hard work, we charge And then we distribute it to charities, basically. So if I'm not earning, if I'm not maintaining good health, how can I extend myself? And similar with healthcare givers and other self-care, oxygen mask is very, very key. And if the guilt comes, recognize it, allow it, understand what the thought process is, give it empathy, and change it to saying, yeah, I am healthy, I'm grateful, and I would like the same for the others. And that's the prayer that we constantly extend. And one more thing I want to add about being okay. We are okay no matter what, because it's our body, which is the death part or the destruction of the body is inevitable. It's a part of living and dying. So being aware of that. So being okay, there's always an okay part that is our spirit, our soul, your whatever you want to call it. So that's always permanently okay. And so mindfulness is about connecting with that permanent inside us, which, like the breath. And so accessing that. And even if your belief systems don't believe in the continuity of the spirit, in the moment, that is what is permanent and existent in all of us. And
That's so powerful.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. I just want to say a quick thank you, Stephanie, Dr. Hamer, because you've just outlined with great depth, although there's wonderful simplicity, right? This thing of awareness is more than we think it is. It is taking the moments to reconnect with ourselves, our own thinking, our own feelings, and in those moments to use our own voices to name for ourselves where we are, and with our intention, now what shall we do? So thank you for that.
Yeah, I was struck by guilt means you want the same thing for the other person, right? And I think that that's, whether we're talking about medical health, people having access to food and being able to take care of themselves, that we don't have to stay in a place where we're primarily, in some ways, guilt gone bad can be when you're only focusing on yourself. But what you're inviting us to do is to focus on the other, to extend it to a hope and a blessing and a prayer, and which can translate into action also,
yes,
right, for the well-being of another person.
Mm-hmm.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. And I think people are very excited about the fact that I thought it was kind of I got concerned that it was a silly question, but I thought maybe not. And so others are glad about it, because we also recognize we also may have essential workers and first responders here on the call. So thank you so very much. I do want to go ahead and check in with each of our presenters. Is there a final word that you'd like to offer around anything you've presented, any hope or concern, and or resources that you could leave us with as we begin to wrap up? And I think we can go in the order that we started with. So Dr. Robinson, we'll go ahead and begin with you.
Sure. Well, I just want to take this opportunity to thank the McCormick Theological Seminary for hosting such an impactful event that is, I think, really nourishing the spiritual, emotional, and physical well-being of all the attendees. I know that I'm leaving this event feeling better, stronger, and more inspired than I was when I started. I think when we bring together all of the comments that we've shared today, I think it's a reminder that we truly have what we need to live through and thrive through the pandemic that we're facing today. We have community, we have knowledge, we have faith, love, and all the different expertise that were provided today. And so I commend you all for your leadership and bringing us all together. And I look forward to the weeks and months that we have ahead. Again, we've got some runway ahead in terms of managing the infection and figuring out the best approach from that perspective. But what you all have done is reminded us of the power that we have both as individuals and as communities to continue to thrive even during a time where we feel this uncertainty here in the near term. So congratulations to you all, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. Thank you very much. Ellen.
I also wanted to say thank you. I actually am grateful for having been asked to participate. As for resources, I encourage your listeners to reach out if they have any particular questions or any particular individual goals or needs, essentially as it relates to nutrition. As for the topic and in summary of today's subject, just try to do and focus on incorporating more fruits and vegetables into your intake, essentially. Going back to, again, the advice of our parents, veggies are good for us. And in fact, even more so than ever, essentially, if we are wanting to minimize our risk and susceptibility for illness or disease, this would be an opportune time for us to commit ourselves or recommit ourselves to doing just that, incorporating appropriate or proper nutrition in order to improve our quality of life as well as our overall health and well-being in general. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Prakarna.
I'd like to say that if you really want to get back to health and heal the world, it's only a breath away. Healing health is only a breath away. And what that means is to constantly stay connected with what is alive, what is accessible. And then the second thing I want to say is when you are aware of it, constantly keep a smile on your face, because that smile has its own magic of internal hormones being released which support the healing, but also it has an impact on people around you. So a positive attitude is very key in all this. And so learn different ways of just staying positive and alive and happy. And health is only a breath away.
Thank you, Dr. Prakarna. Reverend Dr. Wilson, I have a final announcement, but I'll toss it over to you for your closing thoughts as well.
Well, I think it's been said, and I have experienced and still experiencing that breath of fresh air, fresh wind, fresh fire, practical, hopeful, and energized. So I really have a heart of gratitude for all on this call today and our presenters and the comments in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. So for those who have been with us, this is our 4th week in the Trauma Symposium. Our first week was about COVID and mental health. The second week was about parenting in times of stress and also vulnerable children. Unfortunately, we've seen an increase in the amount of child abuse and also intimate violence in homes. So that was a particularly insightful and timely webinar. That second one, our third one, was about COVID grief being different. And then this one about health and immunity. You've been with us this afternoon. We really appreciate all of our presenters and also those who have joined us. Each of the videos, as well as the resources that are presented during the videos, are made available on the websites from McCormick Theological Seminary, as well as also the Chicago Presbytery. If you can give us about a week's worth of lag time to be able to get things up, you can find those resources there. But I also wanted to give you an update on the road forward for the Trauma Symposium. I'm very grateful to the relationship that we have with the Chicago Presbytery and also to my home institution, McCormick Theological Seminary. We will be continuing the Trauma Symposium essentially for about a year. It will look a little bit different in the months ahead. We wanted to start off with 4 weeks of consistent programming to get pertinent information out to our communities. But moving forward in May, beginning next week, we will switch our format to the first and third Thursdays of the month. We've been on every Thursday for April, but starting in May and moving forward, the Trauma Symposium will continue to happen at 12 p.m. on Thursdays, but it will only be twice a month. And that will be the first and the third Thursdays of the month. We will take a break in December, and then we'll come back to start off the new year with the rest of our programming. We do want to give you a heads up that we will switch from, technically we've been doing this through a Zoom meeting. We will switch the format, which may mean also an update in your dial-in information. It will become a webinar. And so we have everybody's registration information. You'll get updated information on the dial-in. The links will also be posted there, but also the dates. I can tell you that we have confirmed for May, our conversations will be about financial trauma. What we recognize is that we are in for a serious economic stressors that are having systemic and structural consequences, but they also have interpersonal consequences. So we'll be talking about financial trauma, but also talking about resources to handle financial trauma, and also maybe some connections and networks in the community around replacing or at least addressing financial deficits in people's individual budgets. But also we recognize we have quite a few clergy, so some clergy support around what may be available institutionally for clergy and their congregations and various different spaces. We're also going to be talking about food scarcity. Ellen, you were so powerfully informative about how to eat, but what we recognize is that the economic consequences of COVID are also triggering food scarcity because people are losing jobs. And so we're going to talk about food scarcity as an actual traumatic event, but also talk about some of the resources that are available here and that are going to continue to be available throughout the city. So please keep an eye on your email for updates on how the Trauma Symposium will continue to move forward. Again, it will move only to the first and third Thursday of the month, starting next week, May the 7th, same time. Keep an eye out for registration updates for the links. Thank you so much to our powerful presenters. You have been wonderful. We appreciate your time, your energy, your insight. Thank you also to my wonderful co-convener. I call her my ride and live buddy, my thought partner. She's a wonderful person to be innovative with. And we thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next week. Take care and be well.
Yes.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.